7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
This is the Radio Random Network. Connect with us on social media at Radio RDM Network on Twitter and Facebook.com/RDM Jams. Rate us on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Enjoy the show and crank it up.
Today's show is brought to you by Racket Sound and Lighting, professional sound, lighting, and DJ services. For more information, call Bob Tolar at 225-773-4639 or visit Facebook.com/Racket Sound and Lighting. If you would like to be an official sponsor of the Radio Random Network, it's real simple. All you have to do is drop me a line at russell.mclean@outlook.com. Subject line, advertise. It's October 31st, 2014. Happy Halloween, everybody. My name is #RDM Russell Devin McLean, and you're listening to the Radio Random Network. Thank you so much for hitting the download button. Today, I have a very special guest joining me on the Radio Random Network. He is one of the world's top directors in the cult horror film world and has many credits and accomplishments to his name. Recently honored by the Duke and Duchess of Wales. On the line, all the way from New Zealand, my good friend, Mr. David Blyth. So from the beginning, where did all of this creative madness start with you?
Well, I was a 16-year-old and I went to a movie at my local cinema, my local art house cinema, and it was a Louis Buñuel film called The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. Louis Buñuel is a Spanish director, but actually made a lot of films in Mexico. Anyway, this particular film really talked to me, and I decided that I wanted to be a filmmaker. So within a year or so, I started actually making short films. My first film was called Circadian Rhythms, a little black and white film. That was 1976. Then 2 years later, I actually made a feature film called Angel Mine, which linked in with the beginning of the current wave of New Zealand filmmaking when the New Zealand Film Commission was formed. And I actually got the very first money ever to help making this film, Angel Mine. Anyway, a few years later, I ended up making New Zealand's first horror film, a film called Death Warmed Up, which was pre-Peter Jackson. He was still at school when I made Death Warmed Up. And it was a mixture of humor and splatter and you know, dark medical happenings and a young man trying to find out his dark past and his father's dark past, Dr. Howell. So that film was picked up in America and was screened. It was a bit of a success, but it was also a film that was rampantly pirated and stolen. And its current status is that we've lost the original negatives in an unfortunate fire, but there is an Interneg, a 35mm Interneg floating around somewhere in the USA, which we hope one day we can retrieve, because at the moment we can't make any prints or get any new copies of that first New Zealand horror film, Death Warmed Up, which is, of course, sad for me because in a way it's the film that I was most well known for. Since then I've worked on many other films. I was up in the States for a period. I did some of the very first episodes ever of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I also worked on a number of vampire and horror films in North America. I did a picture with Al Lewis.
The one and only Grandpa Monster.
And what a character he was. He came down here to New Zealand in his 90s. He had a restaurant in New York called Grandpa's. And he said to me, David, you know, it's not show business, it's business show. And he was a millionaire. He had pasta factories and everything. But he was a great guy, and his sort of history in American vaudeville And on the stage, he goes back to people like Ma and Pa Kettle. I don't know if that rings a bell.
It certainly does ring a bell. You're talking about Percy Kilbride and Marjorie Main.
It was a fantastic experience, and that film was called My Grandpa's a Vampire in America.
Well, that had to be one hell of an experience working with the likes of an icon such as Mr. Al Lewis. So let's fast forward a little bit in your career. You mentioned earlier that you was involved in the ever more popular Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Now, what was your involvement with the popular television show?
Well, I directed 4 episodes in the first 20, and I introduced the Green Ranger in one episode. But it was just interesting to be in on that ground floor of that series at the very beginning when they were sort of feeling their way with the Bible. That's the document that you've got to stick to in terms of not getting too violent and not using weapons in particular ways on television. Of course, that's all long in the past. There were, young kids kung-fuing their way through ranch door sliders and stuff, and there was some debate about, the level of violence and weaponry and what the putties were up to, etc., because it's all long in the past. The interesting thing is that the Power Rangers series has been shot down here in New Zealand for the last 10 years. There's a lot of film activity that's happened in New Zealand. Basically, since Lord of the Rings, we also had Hercules, Xena, Spartacus. All those American TV shows were all shot here in Auckland. And we've also obviously had the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. And because we have a lot of, quite temperate climate and a range of locations, from the sort of epic Middle Earth, vast lakes and, southern Alps, through to sort of semi-tropical in the north of the North Island type locations. New Zealand, fits for quite a few different films.
Right. Now, amongst the Power Rangers, which is very popular here in the United States, you also worked on another very popular sitcom, White Fang. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that was a truly enjoyable experience. It was shot down in Queenstown, and it was a New Zealand and French and I think Australian co-production. So a lot of the cast were from Canada. So it was sort of French-Canadian as well as Canadian.
Yeah.
And I loved working with the Malamute dogs. It was, a great experience. And I actually wrote several episodes as well as directing, I think, about 4 episodes.
Now, your latest project or your latest featured film is The Ghost Bride. Which is set to go VOD and to DVD in November, if I'm not mistaken, of 2014.
That's correct. November the 4th, just one day before Guy Fawkes, which is a celebration that you don't have in America. So, but us English types do still celebrate it. Guy Fawkes tried to blow up Parliament.
Okay.
A whole big pile of gunpowder back in the 18th century, I believe, and it's still celebrated with a huge amount of fireworks.
Okay.
And New Zealand's still one of those countries that hasn't banned fireworks yet completely, but slowly we're losing the ability to use fireworks, and I do love them. Crackers and rockets and all of that. Yes, the film's being released November 4, just one day before November 5th, Guy Fawkes Day. Ghost Bride delves into a whole area around marriage. There's almost a genre of marriage-type films, wedding films, if you like. But I think I've come up with a completely original one, because what I discovered through a Singapore paranormal website was that in the East, in Asia, you can actually be married after you're dead for eternity. And I thought, well, wow, that's pretty interesting, because here in the West, you can only be married if you're alive, and it's all over, Rover, when you die.
Right.
So I thought, wow, there's a cultural conflict. And in China, it's a 2,000-year-old peculiar little tradition that's still practiced in some places in China, including Ma Zedong's own home village up the Yellow River. Some of you may remember Ma Zedong in the Little Red Book. When a young man dies young, they don't want him coming back and disturbing the living and causing bad luck and illness and all the rest of it. So what they do is they find a recently deceased young woman, dig her up, dress her up in the marriage ceremonial costumes, go through a kind of a medieval marriage ceremony where the spirits are invoked back into the body, reanimated. They marry them, and then they stick them in a double coffin and put them back in the ground. And there they go for eternity, married together.
That is very, very interesting, especially knowing that you've done all the research on the culture. I tell you what we're going to do right now, David. We're going to take a short pause, and we're going to pay some bills. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Ghost Bride, working with Josan An. He is a star of Grace, HBO Asia's biggest show. And he also played in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. We'll be right back. Don't go nowhere.
Well, howdy, folks. It's your old pal, Captain Spaulding again. Yes, I'm here to tell you about a brand new attraction. Marry a Monkey Girl. Oh, yeah. That's right. This here little honey is half real human, half monkey. I brought all the way from the wilds of Borneo. So y'all come in, make sure you bring little Johnny and Susie with you. She'll scare the holy guacamole out of them. And remember, while you're down here, pick up your Captain Spaulding for President t-shirts. Come in all shapes and sizes. Small, medium, large, and jumbo for our big bone friends. We all know how you got that way too, huh? Yes, from eating my delicious fried chicken. Oh, yes. Just keeps getting better all the time. God bless America, and God bless Captain Spaulding.
We're doing this
November 4th. Ladies' Choice. The Radio Random Network will feature an interview with the biggest independent R&B music group in the world, the Kings of Slow Jams. Spectrum Music Group presents the legendary icons of R&B, H-Town.
RSVP now at facebook.com/RDM Jams or follow the Radio Random Network on Spreaker. I'm back here on the Radio Random Network with none other than Mr. David, all the way from New Zealand. And David, before we went on break, we were talking about your featured film, The Ghost Bride. And the star of the show is Mr. Josan An, who is the star of HBO Asia's biggest show, Grace.
That's correct. Josan was a discovery. I basically found him on a website, an actor's website, Star Now, and he'd basically done modeling work. I was very impressed with his looks and his abilities as an actor, and basically, gave him the opportunity to have a lead role at 20 years old. One of the other interesting characters in the film is Madam Yin, and her name is Jiling Ching, and she was the China Girl from David Bowie's song China Girl. If you Google David Bowie's China Girl, you'll get the song and a Jiling floating around. They met in a Sydney bar, which is over in Australia.
Yeah.
And so she's actually had a whole career doing films and television in New Zealand. So it was an opportunity to draw on actors that were here in New Zealand. Another actor, Ian McKellen, is one of our most senior actors in New Zealand, and he's been in everything from Lord of the Rings. He's also a director who directed What Becomes of the Broken Hearted, which was the sequel to the Once Were Warriors film, which was one of our more well-known art house type movies that dealt with our indigenous race, the Maori. So New Zealand's had quite an outflowing of cinematic filmmaking in the last 20, 30 years. And in a way, Peter Jackson, it would be the only person that anyone would recognize his name in America, but ironically, I would consider him an international director and one of the top 5 international directors. But he's not really making, for me, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, while our tourist industry has completely jumped on board and we have become Middle-earth, I don't really see those films as being New Zealand films per se. Whereas with the little film I'm making, I'm looking at cultural issues as well as telling a straight genre story, if you like. And I'm fascinated with the fact that, you can maybe take the boy out of China, but can you take his cultural beliefs out of his subconscious? And of course, with a story involving ghost brides, it enables me to really look into that whole world.
Now, with the cultural differences, I mean, did you see? Were there any kind of special rituals or anything that he had to do before, I guess, getting into character?
Well, we needed to procure some of these effigies that they use. They create these paper effigies of the man and the woman, and they put a real live photograph. They pin a real live photograph to the effigy, and then part of the transition between the living and the dead is the burning of these effigies. So I had to get some of those effigies in from China. They were $6 each, but it was more getting them from a village in China onto an aeroplane, airmail to get them to New Zealand, which was the more interesting and more expensive part of it. Had an associate producer who was Chinese, so we were able to, get everything ethnically correct. This initial paranormal website I found in Singapore had an extensive visual and audio documentation of a real ghost bride ceremony. So we were actually using some of the original material. So the film, touches over into some reality elements as well as the genre of the supernatural.
Yes, indeed. Now, how do you prepare for writing something like this?
Well, I obviously went through a number of different drafts. I utilized the research. I tried to do some rehearsals and workshopping with the actors because I'm a great believer in rather than projecting my ideas onto the world, I'm very interested in seeing how my ideas show up in front of my face in the world, so to speak, which is a slightly different perspective and approach. And what that allows is a lot more, let's say, information and possibility to come through workshopping and rehearsal, so that you create the story's integrity through the characters, through the locations that you find, to create a story that you can lead people down into.
Yes. Well, one of your most, I guess, darker films would be your latest. It would be Wound.
Wound was a very hardcore movie, and it was given a wonderful 2 thumbs up, if you like, by Ken Russell, the great English director of extravagant productions. Listomania, Tommy, all sorts of movies that Ken Russell made. The film went to lots and lots of festivals around the world, but it was difficult to get on some of the more mainstream platforms because of the extreme violence. Even though there wasn't a lot in total in the film is still perceived as being quite extreme, with castrations and various other things going on. Wound was based on a New York judicial decision based on a case where a woman took revenge on her father, and it sort of fascinated me, the story, and I ended up utilizing that as the core of this particular film. I'm quite proud of Wound, but found that it was very hard to get a more commercial release for the film. And that's why with Ghost Bride, I've pulled back on the extreme stuff to try and make a film that's more a more general audience film.
Now, amongst everything that you've worked on, what is your most favorite project that you've ever directed or have written?
Well, that's a hard one because, usually it's what you're working on currently that's, full of hope and positivity. But I would say that there was a period where I worked with with the local Maori indigenous people, and I made a film called Kahu and Maya, which has not been shown in America, although it was shown at some indigenous festivals in North America. That's a film I'm really proud of because it involved working in a way without my ego and working in an indigenous storytelling environment, which I found, a very exciting opportunity. I've also made a number of documentaries, which I'm particularly proud of. One of them on my grandfather, who was a First World War veteran, and it's called Our Oldest Soldier.
That's correct.
And my granddad lived to 105, which made him our oldest soldier. But he created a relation. He helped liberate a small French town called Licanoir, not far from the Belgium border, right at the end of the First World War. And that little French town was an ancient fortress town with stone ramparts, and they had decided that they didn't want to destroy these ancient ramparts with heavy bombardment. So what they did was they used ladders to climb these ramparts and take a whole garrison of over 600 Germans. What my grandfather added to the whole story was that he went back to this town 3 or 4 times after the war and created a unique relationship between New Zealand and that French town. And he subsequently did the sister city thing between Licanoir and France and a small town here in New Zealand called Cambridge. And just recently, I got to present that documentary to the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, who happened to be the future King and Queen of England. And they have, obviously, being a military family, Prince William, I'm talking about here.
Yes.
Diana's son. They're interested in military stuff, and they took the documentary, and I got a personal letter back from them complimenting my filmmaking and obviously complimenting my charismatic grandfather. So I guess that would have to be the ultimate highlight. And subsequently, I'm now deeply involved in a project here called Memories of Service, because now many of the Second World War veterans are now in their 90s, because when I interviewed my granddad, he was in his late 90s. So now I'm interviewing World War II veterans, and just recently I interviewed the last living Australian soldier who was on the bridge on the River Kwai, which was a very, very famous railway that was built by Australians and English and many Asians under forced labor by the Japanese in the Second World War. And in fact, the Americans bombed this bridge and destroyed it. And of course, there's the ultimate film on this is David Lean's Bridge on the River Kwai. So, you know, what a fantastic honor to just about interview the last living person from that engagement. I live in a little seaside town called Manly Beach, and interestingly enough, I have 3 Bomber Command pilots. Bomber Command was the English Air Force wing that was the bombers that went over Europe. You know, often there'd be 700 of them go over in one night, and of course dozens of them would never come back.
Yeah.
So I'm continuing the good work that I started with my grandfather now with the Second World War, because, you know, it's only going to be another 20, 30 years before we hit the 100-year anniversary of the Second World War, because we're currently in the 100-year anniversary of the First World War.
Right.
And so I have this whole other side of my filmmaking career where I've undertaken the task of trying to document and interview and film these wonderful veterans.
That's awesome. Now, do you have any advice for anyone that maybe would want to follow in your footsteps?
Well, I actually taught for 12 years at a film school as the directing tutor. And basically, my advice is that you've got to have a vision that you've got to really stick with, but you've got to be open to how the universe is presenting to you in terms of that project. I touched on it a little earlier. My favorite director, Louis Buñuel, had a saying: you always leave the back door open because the gas man might come. And what that sort of translates to is that, well, saying it in another way, expectation is a narrow road. So if you've only got one expectation, then the chances of the universe turning that back at you in a way that you don't like or want is actually quite high. You've actually got to look at what the universe is showing you rather than just trying to project what you think you want on the universe. I know this is deep stuff, but it's actually a fundamental shift that will actually result in a lot more positive things happening for you.
I totally agree with that.
Sorry?
I said I totally agree with that, with what you said about the universe.
Good. And less is more. Everyone tries to write stories that are too overloaded with stuff going on. You've got to keep your themes simple so that you can absolutely explore every element of that theme. And the way that I'm now working in my own script development process, when I'm writing the script, I'm also looking at casting. I'm also looking at locations, so that, for instance, you find a particular location, you are able to somehow physicalize the ideas, the story, the acting, all these elements that you're actually pulling out of your brain to create a script with. If you've got some physical elements like a location, like an actor, then it suddenly starts to become more and more real, and you are actually connected rather than just writing stuff completely off the top of the head, which can have that might not necessarily, capture what you're trying to do, because what you're actually trying to do is tell stories that have a connection to other people, that other people can take from, and those elements are helped by the physicality of finding locations, of finding actors as you're actually creating the story. So you're working in a multi-layered way rather than just, oh, well, I'm sitting in my study and I'm at my computer and I'm going to sit down and write this whole great story. So when I'm working on a script, I start with a lot of research around the type of people, the type of characters, the type of situations. Then I start to create a story outline. I don't even try writing the dialogue early on. I just create the story outline. Then I break the story outline down into exteriors and interiors. And then I start to create little snippets of dialogue. One of the things I've learned is that everyone complains about dialogue in early script versions. And my advice to writers is not to let people completely crush you, because through the process of workshopping, rehearsing, and also even the audition process, writing scenes for the audition process can be a fascinating part of creating your script, because you can try out that particular piece of script on a whole bunch of different prospective actors, and suddenly you're seeing that particular actor and their voice and their interpretation, and sometimes they all come together and it comes alive, and suddenly the dialogue finds its voice for the character.
Yes, indeed. Well, I appreciate all of that knowledge.
Well, it's just, at the end of the day, you have to believe in yourself and you have to have focus. And my feeling is that even though, and you have to keep making decisions, and the thing is that not every decision will be right. But I find that if you've got an integrated vision of your little film, your short film, whatever length, even though there are parts that may not completely work, the film will still have its own integrity. So that's what you've got to go with, and that's what you've got to believe in. And at the end of the day, don't let the costs, crush your spirit. There are so many different little ways that you can make films. And, of course, up in the States, there's that whole tradition of mumblecore films, which are in the sort of $10,000 to $15,000 range, which, of course, is what you used to be able to get back as an advance for DVD. But, of course, the DVD market has collapsed, and we're hopeful that we're going to get a red box deal for Ghost Bride in the States. But the DVD market is definitely not what it used to be. And that, of course, was always a very lucrative side for the indie filmmaker. Yeah. So that brings us back full circle to this the digital distribution world with how, the VOD thing in particular is becoming more and more significant.
Yes, indeed. Well, that's about all the time we have today, Mr. David. I appreciate you finally catching up with us, and I thank you so much for giving us an insight into the film industry as far as, I guess, New Zealand side. It was very interesting, and I look forward to talking with you very soon again.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Russell. I love the opportunity, and I'm excited to be talking to you up in the States.
Thank you very much, my